a certain way to look at politics which is value neutral and realist, and it's the way of the tradition of the Austrian Enlightenment tradition of the social sciences, and you may know part of that as Austrian Economics. And that way of looking at politics is really about looking at societal change and trying to understand societal change. And what's really surprising is how little societal change has to do with the kind of politics, you know, from TV or social media, party political bickering. What most people assume how you change society, you do is you're bickering until you convince the majority of the population, and then you enact the change top down. Very odd, it's all backwards. Usually there's change, and then gradually, and then suddenly majority opinion changes, and then really the last guys to change are politicians. So really you shouldn't look at politicians if you look at change. So I assume you all want to change society, and you'd like me to tell you how. And I've seen that Nietzsche is somehow the paragon of this event. So I'll paraphrase him. He more or less wrote, don't worry about the how, it's important that you get a why. So that's the more important questions. Why? What do you want to change society? And of course, change is something relative. So you need to define a baseline. You need to figure out, okay, what's the status quo? What's the baseline I'm comparing to? And then only if you see so much at fault that is status quo, that you are willing to bear the uncertainty of change, then of course you'd have a why. So more complicated than that, the baseline actually is not a status. The status is not a status. It's change. The baseline is change. And it's ever-changing change. So that basically defines modernity. That we live through change, and not only change, it's changing rates of change. And interestingly, that's the reason why most politics that you know, is actually a reaction against change. No matter if it's left or right wing, usually it's reactionary, it's a reaction against change, because we have a hard time keeping up with the changing rates of change. So, but let's assume that we come to the conclusion there's too much bad change happening and too little good change, and I share that assessment of the status quo, and I'll add a certain specific criticism of the status quo. That's the economic one, that according to John Maynard Keynes, we are in the long run, but contrary to John Maynard Keynes, we are not dead. So we get to live to see the results of capital depletion. That is, that means that more capital has been consumed than regenerated or built. Well, of course, you don't have to agree. That's a certain specific assessment of where we are at these times, that some of that bad surprisings and disappointments and kind of change you don't like to see, and better change that you don't get to see, is due to that kind of discoordination in time within society. So that's something in that very complicated fabric of changes and reactions against changes, somehow something got broken, and we got to figure out how to improve that, and that's why we are willing to take the uncertainty of change. Now, what's the wisest advice on how to change society is be the change you want to see in society, and it assumes, and I think it's generally the right way, not assume that you'll have to convince everyone and then somehow change build there, but try to figure out if you can change something that may be passed on, that other people may copy and realize that it's really a change for the better. But that of course assumes that you, let's say as a pleb, as someone who's not in charge, have a choice and have a say, and that of course is not always the case. You can think of a feudal order where you are just a servant, and even if you change, it's got no, it does not affect society at all. And I think the opposite of that kind of order, where you don't have any effect, is a market economy, according to the definition, I think is the best definition of a market economy by Ludwig von Mises. He said a market economy is a continuous plebiscite. So it means the plebs decide by deciding what, when, and if they consume, they determine the production structure. What kind of resources are used in which way to bring about what kind of structures, societal structures, physical structures, cultural structures, and so on. So I think that's a good definition, and that of course shows us another thing that may be wrong, that we may be living through a reaction against that kind of order. We may live in a time of a tendency towards a maybe more feudal order, and it's not by just overtly taking away your power, it's a very hidden way of rigging this kind of voting mechanism. Because what's the continuous plebiscite? It's every cent that you spend or every set that you spend is a vote. And of course we can see that the kind of monetary policy we have nowadays is a massive rigging of this kind of voting machine. It's producing endless amounts of votes, which of course has a disempowering effect. So what do the plebs do if they're feeling powerless? They unite, and there are generally two ways to unite. You can align along means or tools, and you can align along values. So you seek out other people who share your values, or you seek out other people who share the same means, and those are two very different approaches to uniting. The one seems to be more a communal approach, the other one seems to be a bit more entrepreneurial approach. And I think in the space that we are interested in, there are two prototypes of these approaches. And I'm going to call them the Bitcoin citadels and the blockchain experiments. And I think both are efforts to bring about change by uniting plebs either along values or along means used. Now hold tight onto your seats. Another trigger warning, I'll say something shocking. When you hear about a blockchain experiment that's getting traction, it's getting interest, funds are coming in, they'll be able to sponsor a conference like that. If you don't know anything else about them, what's the likeliest assumption you have to make? It's a scam, right? So I think the likeliest assumption, if you know nothing else about a blockchain experiment, it's a scam. If you see a Bitcoin citadel gaining traction, which means not just one Bitcoiner declaring the home where he's raising a family, a citadel, but it's actually like people settling together in their own citadel, what's the safest assumption if you don't know anything about it? It's a cult, right? So that's why crypto is basically scams and cults, but I promised it'll be value neutral, non-judgmental way. So hear me out a little bit. I'll try to explain it and differentiate it and figure out, I mean, what's at the core of that thing. So what's a scam? A scam is a promise of value that can't be fulfilled. And the reason why almost every innovation first looks like a scam and seems like a scam and may turn out to be a scam is really in the structure of societal change. Society is a fabric of knowledge. And of course, every change, every innovation, in a way, invalidates that knowledge. It's contrarian. Every innovation is contrarian. And if contrarians were always right, there would be no society. There would be no, I mean, this fabric of knowledge would be worthless, so there wouldn't be any reason for society. So contrarians usually are wrong, but those that are not wrong are extremely important. So that's this kind of paradoxical relation. That's why most promises of value can't be fulfilled. And now there's a spectrum, of course. I mean, you may know that you won't be able to fulfill that promised value, but usually it's not that easy, because there's as I said, quite a spectrum. I mean, one way to convince other people that you'll be able to fulfill a promise of value is convincing yourself first. That's the easiest way. So you may be convinced, you may believe yourself that you're able to, And it's even more complicated than that. In many ways, having other people believe that you're able to deliver that value increases the chance of you being able to deliver that value. And that, of course, is behind the entrepreneurial wisdom of fake it until you make it. And it's the more important, the more you are in industries where network effects are crucial. And anything related to monetary things, of course, has lots of importance of network effects. So there's quite a spectrum, and I think the real criminal scams are not that interesting proportion. Even though in crypto they are a larger part, and I'll get to that in a minute. So I think it's quite natural that with innovation, most innovations seem like a scam in the beginning, and most will turn out to be scams in the sense not that there's criminal intent, but just the value promised can't be fulfilled. Now, most people assume that crypto is so full of scams and criminal scams because it's unregulated, and that shows you, I mean, that's the surprising thing of the Austrian School of thinking, that in so many ways it shows you how backward assumptions are in economics and politics. Usually they are not just wrong, it's just the opposite. And this assumption is the same as thinking that drug markets are ruled by shady criminals because it's such an unregulated free market, and they are all unlicensed drug dealers. Of course, that's a half-truth. That's worse than a lie. Of course, the reason is if you outlaw and make it legally impossible for any honest entrepreneur to take part in the system, you will have a selection effect and a remainder that looks even shadier. And then, of course, you have the intervention spiral of legitimizing your regulation in the first place. And something very similar happens here. It's called regulatory arbitrage, which is one of the reasons even the conspicuous scams may seem to be more frequent within this era. Oh, within that sphere. Now, what is a cult? A cult usually is like a sect, it's a secession from society because you have an impression that nothing is true and everything is permitted. So you seek something that's true, you seek a truth with other people, and you want to live in a way that not everything is permitted. You have quite strict rules. Usually you have dietary rules, which you religiously follow, and you get an alignment with other people because there's a price to pay to be part of that aligned community. And of course, every culture starts out as a cult, and it looks like a cult before with this alignment. Usually they're like smaller and less people affected, and most cults, of course, die as a cult. They start as a cult and they die as a cult, and so don't affect that much change neither. And I think that's, again, it can be explained easily from the structure of societal change, how it comes about. So a cult is an intentional community, and I think we're living through a time where, and I see that quite a lot of increased interest, not only in intentional communities, but also in political experiments, and they seem to be quite closely related to the change or longing for monetary experiments or fixing something in that era. And that's surprising because there's quite a historical analogy to that. So I have the impression we are living through a time where it seems like now in the intersection of the internet, cryptography and open source software, something new is emerging, and seems quite an innovative area where we have at the same time technological and cultural, that is societal change happening. Now, not quite sure yet what the essence will be, but something is happening, and it seems to be a linkage between new monetary protocols and then potentially new societal protocols. And something very similar happened with the end of the Roman Empire, which of course never really ended, but there was enough turmoil to call it an end. And what happened there is that, of course, what was the center and the focus got to the periphery, and what was peripheral got to the center, and those are the North Italian cities as one part of, I'd say, political experiments. And we had a lot of intentional communities forming at the time. Now, if you would have guessed at the time, you'd say there's intentional communities, very cult-like, won't affect that much change. They seem very odd. I mean, in these cults, even men stop procreating, so very odd cults that formed. And of course, those intentional communities were the monasteries, spread that really increased with the end of the Roman Empire. And it's quite surprising to me, and not that easy to explain, how the monasteries finally, even though they're like very seceding from society, seeking a refuge and negating all the values, because like nothing is true, everything is permitted, so let's like permit the least possible and seek the truth, very pure movements. Over time they turned out to be hubs not only of culture but of technology as well, for quite odd reasons. One of the reasons is that monks can't work that much because they have to pray, so they were really big in value in labor-saving technologies. But just as interesting as the monasteries, which are underestimated, I think, are the city-states emerging with the fall of the Roman Empire. And they are underestimated now even more so than ever, because the nation-state was such a seemingly success story, even though it brought so much blood and so much collateral damage to the world, and it still does every hour and every minute we speak, but still it's quite underestimated how important those experiments were. And it's surprising that those new experiments were hubs of monetary innovation and political innovation. So we had breakthroughs in monetary protocols, the florin and the golden standards, double entry, bookkeeping, but also, of course, the shady and scammy banking schemes that we've known for quite a while. And quite interesting, some of the first skyscrapers, amazing skyscrapers. And now another trigger warning, I may insult some of you. I think those skyscrapers in the North Italian cities are like the perfect analogy of an NFT, because if you look at them, I mean, they are impressive from the outside. The inside, they are quite disappointing. They are empty and useless, because what they've done with the skyscraper is they've abstracted away every utility other than status. So they are pointless status games. Those family towers in the northern Italian cities, they're just pointless status games. But still, of course, they are showcases for technology and culture. And on the way, you may have learned something by doing these pointless status games. And what we see in these experiments is they are quite wasteful. So, of course, it's an amazing waste, particularly in the short term. In the long term, not so sure with the Italian tourism. But in the short term, impressive waste. Just as scams and cults, I'd be a bit more tolerant about waste. And I think something that Ayn Rand wrote is quite telling. She said that you can distinguish a free from an unfree society in the following way. In a free society, resources are wasted. Because, of course, there's not one authority that can tell you what's the right thing to do. So people try out stuff and most doesn't work out, so there's a lot of waste of resources. An unfree society wastes human beings, and it's the difference, I think it's an important difference to make. And I think that gives a strong why, again, or a third formulation of that why would you want to change society? And I think one of the strongest whys is to combat that terrible waste of human potential that we're seeing in soulless bureaucracies of the state, of corporations, of pointless projects, of bullshit jobs, as you may want to call it. I think that's one of the strongest whys for societal change, to do something about this tremendous waste of human potential. How do you go about that? I think it's an approach that's neither naively optimistic and not just cheerleading, because if you're naively optimistic about change and just cheerleading, you'll be cheerleading a lot of wasted human potential. And in particular, if the framework is distorted, and in particular if the coordination mechanism is distorted. Now it's quite something, or it's quite different if you ask yourself what brought more change within the Soviet Union, where you have a distorted structure. And there you had both approaches, like people aligning along means and trying to figure out better ways to cope with the situation and profit of the opportunities there. So I'd say the more entrepreneurial approach. And then you have the more people like aligning along values and trying to help each other. And that, I think, is the prototype of the oligarch versus the Solidarność movement or union. And so what's usually, I'd be quite skeptical about these value-aligned movements, and I'd be more friendly towards the entrepreneurial movements if the structure by which you judge entrepreneurial success is distorted. Of course, it's not so obvious. It's not so obvious that the more capitalist or entrepreneurial approach is usually the less wasteful and better approach, and the more communal approach is the less wasteful approach. So you can't even be sure about that. And I think that's one of the reasons why, or another reason why the blockchain era is so full of scams. It's not only the structure of societal change which makes it that way. It's not only a regulatory arbitrage, it's that due to a seemingly unrelated intervention and structure, the whole coordination mechanism is distorted. So the main use case, the main thing people would like to fix is monetary assets. It's storing value, and there, of course, you have very distorted incentives. So a lot of the projects actually are mistaken for answers or dabbling in monetary assets, and it gives quite bad incentives, and it increases, again, the proportion, not of criminal intent, I'd say, but how people perceive it, use it, and what are the most prominent use cases. And then, of course, in a society which by intervention has become more short-term oriented, and where there's quite a separation between your decisions to consume or not consume and the capital structure, you'll have a more higher prominence of short-term use cases like entertainment, distraction, and so on. So I think it's also the distorted structure around that explains a little bit more why it may seem that you can't even find one project that's not too scammy to sponsor a conference like that, which is quite odd. So, of course, you're all aware of the monetary experiments, and what you may not be aware is that we're living through a time, as with the fall of the Roman Empire, of new experiments in societal protocols. And there are two approaches. Now, the Bitcoin citadel approach is not really a prototypical city. So that's a wrong perception. I think the longing for a Bitcoin citadel, of course, you all know the original meme and how it has been repurposed to express a certain longing. And it's the longing of living with people whose value you share. And that's the classical definition of an intentional community. They are usually fairly small, and there is an impressive hype in intentional communities, so many projects getting started, not even mainly related to Bitcoin. You have all the eco-villages and the permaculture and subsistence farming projects, and all kinds of different things. And then, of course, you have the bad intersection of cult and scam, which is the affinity scam, like Crypto Island or so on. Even if I'm not saying it's criminal intent, it's just the incentives are really bad, in particular this intersection. But we not only have a hype of intentional communities at the moment, we have a hype of new city creations and formations, and that I think generally is a positive sign. It's a sign of a renaissance. of trying to figure out new protocols of living together, new rule sets, and I think it's at least the second most important and fascinating field of innovation besides monetary innovation. I still believe that money as the coordination mechanism is even more crucial than thinking about the rule set, how you live together, but at least the second most important sphere. And those experiments, usually they work out if they are entrepreneurial, so they're promises of value. It's entrepreneurs doing what Balaji Srinivasan calls society as a service. Of course, like software as a service, which is like subscription-based society as a service provided by a provider who is taking the risk to start a new city. And I think in particular, or in the purest form, I think it's the Free Private Cities project by Titus Gebel, but I'm a bit biased maybe. So I think most of these city projects will fail. I think if you know nothing else about it, assume it's a scam, just as a heuristic, a rule of thumb. And I hope I've explained to you why that's in no way negative. It's just a value-neutral observation of how things are. But worse than just seeing that is trying to do something against it in a political way, and that's why you try to fight scams with regulation, and you try to fight cults with a kind of inquisition and social pressure. And both approaches are very wrong-headed. I try to explain why regulation actually, instead of reducing scams, increases the amount of scams. And there's another psychological reason for that, and that was observed by Alexis de Tocqueville. He said there's a kind of evil paternalism. It's like people think they got to protect other adults from their life choices. And it's not a good kind of paternalism, because a good kind of paternalism is fatherly. You want to protect your child so it grows up to be an adult. Evil paternalism is you want to protect something to keep him dependent like a child for the whole of his life and prevent him from becoming an adult, prevent him from being capable to bear responsibility. And of course, decreases the responsibility and the capability of people to take this burden of responsibility, and increases in the long term the amount of scams or the amount of people that will fall prey to scams because they were never allowed to learn the hard way. And I think we should cherish failure, as most new projects will fail, but you learn much more from failure than you learn from success, because success can have lots of reasons. Failure always changes your course. So it's absolutely crucial for bettering of society to have failure, to permit failure. And you can't fight that by protecting people from failing. And usually by trying to protect people from failing, even then if you have then that kind of interventionism, which tries to make up for it and bail out and so on, you just increase it to a systematic scale of failing and make it much worse. Now the way to fight cults, where social pressure and calling out people and calling out their ideology or religion doesn't make sense neither. What is quite interesting is if you push cults or sects and you try to prove to them that their predictions, their truth that they are following is wrong, is not validated by reality, that reality contradicts, in particular for apocalyptic sects. I mean, they make quite clear predictions of impending doom, and doom doesn't happen. So should you point the finger and tell them, see, you were wrong? The interesting observation is they are increasing their conviction. They are doubling down. So even if you try to prove to them that they're contrary to reality, their conviction increases. So it's contrary to what you expect. And I think generally it's been the other approach from the mainstream, other than regulation, to the Bitcoin phenomenon has been this kind of pigeonholing, ideological pigeonholing, like this big conspiracy theories that Bitcoin is this evil libertarian project, or even worse than libertarian, like this Peter Thiel kind, evil guy libertarianism or alt-right libertarianism. There are even books on that now, like The Politics of Bitcoin, the ideology behind, the secret ideology behind Bitcoin. It's all backwards. I think libertarianism is largely irrelevant to the adoption of Bitcoin. by now. Of course, libertarians like it and tend to like it, but if you look at the history of its adoption, largely irrelevant to it. And that's this wrong perception that you got to pigeonhole people, that you figure out there's something like a Bitcoiner and you try to find out what's his religion or his ideology because you distrust it, you're not quite sure why is he using it. And I think this way you just increase the cultishness again, because you're pigeonholing people and you're defining terms that have no match in reality. I don't even believe there's something like the libertarian or something like that. Those are just constructs, labels that you use as heuristics, which usually do more harm than good, because they take away your empathic understanding of the other person you're looking at, and you try to label him and then class him with other people you've maybe talked to, or worse, you've read other people writing about other people who wrote about those people, which are fictive classes that you're looking at. So both ways don't really work. How do we get to the kind of positive culture allowing for these failures? As I said, it's not the positive cheerleading. I think there is some need for a kind of toxicity, but it's a toxicity not against the waste of resources, a toxicity against the waste of human potentials, and in particular two prototypes of people that either in the projects that align along the values, which I would call the oligarchs. I mentioned them before. If the whole structure is wrong, then you have people who seemingly very entrepreneurial are capturing more value than they are creating value, just because the whole structure and coordination mechanism goes wrong. And on the other hand, you have the gurus, people who claim to provide certainty but actually benefiting of uncertainty, because they make people long for it, kind of fake and quick fix certainties. So I think there's a need for even more toxicity against potential oligarchs and gurus. And on the other hand, I think there shouldn't be that kind of pessimistic negativity of just seeing flaws in projects and being angry about anyone not spending all the resources he has in the one project you think is the only worthwhile pursuing, and so on. So it's mindset in between this cheerful optimism and this negative pessimism. I'd call it critical rationality. And I think it's a mindset that emerged within the crisis in old Austria as well. It was a crisis, not only economic crisis, it was a crisis of knowledge and a crisis of trust. People were not sure who to trust anymore. You had all kind of crazy ideologues and gurus emerging. You had in the same coffee shop a Hitler and a Lenin and a Stalin meeting up and sharing their certainties with other people. And within that framework, a kind of critical rationality, which is non-judgmental, because it first tries to understand, very critical, but still positive in a way that you are in favor of human flourishing, you're in favor of win-win cooperation, you don't try not to judge someone before you understand him, you are optimistic about progress, or you favor progress in a certain sense, you think that things can get better and should get better. And I think it's that particular mindset that makes it worthwhile to continue those traditions. I think that's why they're perfect match to these monetary innovations that you're taking interest in, and the potential experiments or experiments in societal protocol innovations that I'm quite interested in and eager about as well. And even though most may turn out as scams and cults, I think a society that allows for that and allows adults to make their mistakes is a better one. So the true societal change usually is a mix of technological change and cultural change. And throughout modernity, we've had this kind of change, which are these odd sigmoid curves. And that's how cultural change happens. It means it's a persevering persistence against all odds. Culture comes from cultivating. It's against the elements. You persist in cultivating something. And it may mean to do a conference even though you have to say no to all the sponsors. It's a kind of perseverance, I think, is part of a long time cultural shift and change, because every good change, which is this connection between technological and culture change, every good change happens first gradually and then suddenly. Thank you.